We return live to the United Nations for continue following the event held at the United Nations General Assembly as they debate the necessity of eliminating the U.S. blockade against Cuba.
Mr. President, we welcome the participation in today's meeting the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. We would subscribe to the statement made by Eritrea on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter. In addition, we'd like to share a number of considerations in our national capacity. Our position is determined not only by our long-standing and special relationship with the brethren people of the Island of Freedom, but our rejection of the international legal arbitrariness in the spirit of a rules-based order. Together with the overwhelming majority of members of the international community, we demand an immediate and unconditional lifting of the American economic, trade, and financial blockade against Cuba. And we support the provisions of the draft resolution introduced by Cuba into the General Assembly. We express a strong protest against a gross violation by the United States of the founding principles of international law and the UN Charter. The actions of the United States and their allies in introducing unilateral illegal sanctions in circumvention of the UN Security Council are openly neocolonial in character and are based on systematic attempts to persecute and suppress undesirable regimes around the world. While hypocritically imposing sanctions against the countries and entire peoples as a way of non-military using non-military means to react to crimes against humanity and fulfilling their international obligations. The U.S. prefers not to notice the horrific consequences of their own actions, which lead to the most severe humanitarian consequences for ordinary people around the world. The anti-Cuban embargo is an excellent example of the foreign pressure by Washington in the spirit of the rebirth of the Monroe Doctrine, which is an unconcealed interference into the internal affairs of a sovereign country, demonstrating disregard for humanitarian values and human rights. The blockade of a sovereign state that doesn't represent any threat to the United States or its citizens, and using restrictions as norms of intergovernmental relations undermines the foundations of global and regional stability and development. More and more states are sharing this position, including Cuba's neighbors in the region, which are suffering secondary and tertiary consequences of anti-Cuban sanctions. We believe that the Secretary General, who is supposed to assist in implementing the decisions of the General Assembly, must pay particular attention to this. However, this is not all. The over 60 years of the consistent practice of the policy of the American government in trying to suffocate the will of the Cuban people to resist is nothing but an unprecedented challenge for the entire system of international relations. This is becoming more and more clear, and it will be an example of, for those who still have doubts, how the United States, how it understands abiding by international law, or rather ignoring international law. It's important to recall the arrogant attempts to divide the world into democracies and authoritarian regimes against whom, based on the logic of the USA and their allies, you can introduce punitive illegal sanctions as an instrument of collective punishment for their free choice about their own path of development. I'd like to also recall that just recently in this room, the member states at the summit of the Sustainable Development Goals noted the crossing in the midway point in implementing the 2030 Agenda. The political declaration adopted with great pomp and supported by all, including by the U.S. delegation. We agreed that no one was supposed to be left behind in that declaration. However, the maintenance of the blockade against Cuba is the antithesis of sustainable development, which fully devalues the broadly advertised efforts by the United States in providing support for international development. The blockade significantly complicates implementing the socio-economic transformations in Cuba, causes significant damage to the economy, restricts the opportunities for expanding trade, interbank cooperation, and financial operations with foreign partners, which also is an obstacle to the full integration of Havana into the global financial economic architecture, and ultimately complicates implementing the SDGs. The huge losses from the American embargo for the Cuban economy are massive. The figures speak for themselves. From March of 2022 to February of 2023, the losses were $4.8 billion. That is over 405 million per month. Now, if we look at the overall damage to October 2023 for the whole history of the embargo, we're talking about $159 billion. On the humanitarian level, the embargo is the main barrier to the full enjoyment of human rights in Cuba, first and foremost in socioeconomic development, healthcare, education, energy, and food security. Particularly disgusting are attempts by the United States to put Cuba, which has provided assistance throughout the world and has sent brigades of doctors as well as medication around the world, to try to put them on the list of sponsors of terrorism. It's no surprise, actually. Even during the pandemic, Washington did not agree to provide exemptions against sanctions, which prevented Cuba from obtaining important medicine, medical oxygen, and other important equipment. Furthermore, what is not taken into account is the constructive role of Cuba and its deserved reputation as a constructive force in global integration processes. Just recently, the G77 held a meeting on science, technology, and innovation in Havana. We believe that maintaining the trade, economic, and financial blockade against Cuba by the U.S. is not only counterproductive, but it's illegal and anti-humanistic. This unjustified measure sheds light on the anti-humanistic essence of the American policy in the face of the majority of the global community, including its own allies. Unfortunately, we regret that 30 years in a row of adopting the same resolution has not been enough to lift the blockade. In this connection, we hope that the administration and Congress of the United States will once again heed the overall appeal and lift the anti-Cuban embargo and strike Cuba from the list of sponsors of terrorism without any preconditions or any kind of measures to reduce its sovereignty. We will unequivocally support this resolution. The position of our country is expressed in the statement of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation to the General Assembly and the parliaments of member states on the need to stop the anti-Cuban blockade by the United States. We will distribute the text to the Secretariat as a document to the General Assembly. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of